Did you know that the first ballpoint pen was invented in 1888? And it's safe to say since then, it's come a long way from where it started. He realized there had to be a better way to write with a pen than having to dip it into ink every few seconds. So, one day, he decided to take matters into his own hands. But how far did it come? Well, that's what we're here to show you. There was even one brand that used a hollow tube inside the pen that would spin around inside the ink bottle when you start writing. As you can see, this isn't anything like the pens we're used to today. One day, he had a eureka moment when he was sitting in a barber's chair getting a shave. He looked over and saw the barber's brush, and this gave him the idea to roll the ink into the tip of the pen using a small ball. This would mean that the ink wouldn't leak out of the pen until it reached the tip. And that's how the ballpoint pen was born. It looks more like a pencil. The reason why this is the first ballpoint pen ever invented is because of this right here. The ink comes from the bottom of the pen up through this pipe and into the tip of the pen. To make a single pen, they would have to cast the parts in metal, which was expensive and time-consuming. After seeing John's invention, a businessman called George McGill wanted to improve upon the design. They also came up with a new way of producing the pens. Instead of casting the parts in metal, they decided to machine them out of solid metal. This was a lot more expensive, but it meant that they could produce more pens in less time. With this new efficient production method, they began selling their new ballpoint pens for $2.50, and if you were writing in hot weather, the ink would literally melt and ruin your pages. Since there was a shortage of metal, they had to use plastic instead, which made the pens cheaper to produce, and began producing his own versions of the ballpoint pen. Schieffer's pens worked a lot better than the previous models. The inks didn't leak or dry out, and it became the go-to pen for many writers. Suddenly everyone was buying them. At this point, it seemed like the ballpoint pen was going to be the next big thing. Despite all these issues, the ballpoint pen was slowly becoming more popular. If you want to see more videos like this, stay tuned. Thanks for watching. With the help of a friend called T.J. O'Brien, who was a skilled engineer, they set to work. People were sick of using ballpoint pens and wanted to return to the elegance of fountain pens. He came up with the idea of putting a tiny ball bearing inside the pen. This meant that the ball would spin faster and leave a smoother line on the paper. Today, they're cheap, reliable, and available in every color imaginable. We've even got fancy ones that write in multiple colors or even glitter. Who knows what the future will hold for the ballpoint pen? Maybe one day we'll have self-inking pens, or maybe pens that can write in invisible ink. But one thing's for sure, the ballpoint pen has come a long way since John Loud sat down to invent the very first one. Biro also developed a new type of ink that wouldn't bleed onto your fingers. Suddenly, ballpoint pens were cool again, plus, ballpoint pens had a reputation for ruining paper. It wasn't until 1904 that someone did something crazy. He opened new factories all across the US and Europe to keep up with demand. By 1912, the company was employing over 1,000 people and had annual sales of $1 million. That year, George sent a letter to every major newspaper in the U.S. offering a reward of $1,000 to anyone who could stay ahead of his traveling salesman for 30 days. But luckily, in 1953, a chemist named E.B. Irie solved this problem when he invented quick-drying ink. This changed everything. Overnight, everyone was using ballpoint pens again. This bizarre stunt attracted a lot of attention, and soon everyone was talking about the amazing ballpoint pen. Overnight, the company went from near bankruptcy to making $1,000 a day. In the end, they couldn't keep up with demand, and after a year of being in business, the brothers closed shop. Then the ball rolls the ink onto the paper. For a start, the ink these pens used would often leak out of the tip when you weren't using it. This was because the pressure of everyday use would cause the ink to be pushed through the tube and out of the tip. This meant that if you put your pen in your pocket with some other pens, they could get ink all over your clothes. This was because the ball was so light that vibrations from writing would make the ball skip across the paper. Another issue is that the ink would sometimes clump up and block the tube, meaning you'd have to pull the pen away from the paper to unclog the ink. This is a far cry from the simple design of the modern-day ballpoint pen, which doesn't need any fancy gizmos or gadgets to make it work. He improved his design and filed a patent for his new invention. In 1889, he founded the company The Ballpoint in New York with his brother and began selling his pens for $10 each. Despite the high price tag, people were willing to pay it. Everyone wanted to get their hands on the latest technology, and these pens sold out instantly. Because the ball was so small, it meant that the line the pen made on the paper was also very small. And if you look closely at the tip of the pen, you'll see that it's not even a ball. It's actually a small cylinder with a concave surface on one end. This means that the lines the pen makes aren't smooth. Instead, they have a slight texture to them. This is because the ball ain't rolling over the paper. Instead, it's just leaving a small indent in the ink and pushing it onto the paper. This is the very first ballpoint pen ever invented by John Loud. John made this invention while he was working at his father's company, which made metal tips for typewriters. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about how a normal pen works, because it is quite different to how a ballpoint pen works. If you look at the tip of a normal pen, you'll see it's just a small piece of metal. When you start writing, the tip of the pen leaves a mark behind because the metal has absorbed some of the ink. However, every few seconds or so, the tip runs out of ink. So, you have to dip it back into the ink bottle to get more ink onto your page. Now, obviously, this is not ideal when you're trying to write something important. You don't want to have to keep dipping your pen into an ink bottle. So people came up with other ideas. Someone had the idea to put a small hole in the pen so they could suck up the ink from inside the pen without having to fully dip the tip inside an ink bottle. Other pens used a valve system where a button on the side of the pen would allow air into the pen to push the ink out of the tip. Then there were pens that used a spring to constantly push the ink up to the top of the pen. The problem with this, however, was that it left a huge mess every time you took the cap off to write. Then there were pens that used a tiny pump inside the pen to draw the ink up from the bottom of the barrel. So now that we've seen how complicated these early pens were, let's take a look at the first ballpoint pen ever invented. When John was coming up with ideas for a new kind of pen, he wanted to find a way to stop the ink leaking from the tip of the pen. As you can see, it looks very different from the designs we're used to today, but the principle behind it is still the same. But this design had its limitations. The first ballpoint pens also suffered from skipping, which is when the ball misses the paper and doesn't leave a mark behind. Despite all these issues, John was convinced this was the future of writing. However, business didn't remain good for long. The biggest problem was that the pens were too expensive to produce. Although John's company wasn't a success, his invention wasn't forgotten about. O'Brien redesigned the tip of the pen so it would leave a smoother line on the paper. But despite the lower price, sales were slow. People didn't realize how much better these new pens were compared to the old ones. After seeing how well the ballpoint pen was doing, George knew he had to expand. At this point, you might think that these pens would become popular straight away. But actually, there was still a lot of work to do. Another issue was that the ink would dry too quickly, meaning you'd have to keep dipping your pen into the ink bottle to stop it from drying out. In 1914, they started doing even better when World War I broke out. But unfortunately, the company went bankrupt in 1917. That same year, a man named Walter A. Schieffer bought the patents for the ballpoint pen. For a while, it seemed like the ballpoint pen had finally made it. But in the 1940s, fountain pens made a comeback. But in the late 1940s, Laszlo Biro, a journalist from Hungary, reinvented the ballpoint pen. But there was still one problem: the ink still dried too quickly. And since then, the ballpoint pen has gone from strength to strength. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like It really helps me out.